So people keep telling me that documentation is boring, but at this time we have 5 different talks happening at the exact same time. So we have talks about CI/CD systems, we have talks about Angular, we have talks about progressive web apps and using sensors in your browser. But you guys are here to listen to me talk about documentation, which is interesting. So thanks for showing up. Who am I? My name is Joao, and I do documentation for Docker. More specifically, I've been leading the documentation efforts at Docker in the enterprise part of Docker. And this is really interesting because most people don't even know that Docker has a commercial part. And I've been at Docker for 1.5 years, which in Docker years is a bit. I've been doing docs, training, user experience, user research at other companies. And in this session, I'm going to try to convince you of 3 things. That crossing the chasm is hard, and it can drain your engineering resources. That documentation can help you avoid that, but only if you use the right process to create documentation. So I'm going to start explaining what this chasm thing is all about. Then I'm going to explain the impact that crossing the chasm can have for your teams. Then I'm going to explain how docs can help you relieve the burden for your teams. And of course, docs can only help if they're good enough. So I'll explain the process that you should be using to create your own docs. And finally, I'm going to tell you how we're doing this process at Docker, and hopefully share with you some strategies and tools that we've been using to make our lives easier. So what is the chasm? The chasm is a moment in your product lifecycle where you've already convinced a lot of early adopters to use your product. And now you're in the process of convincing everyone else to use the product too. And this is kind of a painful moment for every product or every company. And for sure, Docker is no exception to this. This transition period is really hard because early adopters are totally different from mainstream users. These users have different needs, they have different goals. And so what I mean by this is that if you look into an early adopter, they're mostly hackers and thinkers at heart. So they really love playing with products that are new, are shiny, and probably are going to be buggy. Early adopters have fun understanding what is your product and how it works. In fact, they have so much fun that sometimes they don't even care if your product creates more problems than the ones it solves. Early adopters have fun tuning and troubleshooting your product, and they really take pride in reporting bugs. So if you happen to be like Docker and you have open source products, this is the kind of user that will help you out and probably will start submitting pull requests to fix their own issues. Early adopters care a lot about the underlying technology that you're using, and they really care about the way you're architecting your product. So this is the kind of user that prefers you to use a new, exciting technology, even at the cost of not properly integrating with other existing technologies that might be out there. And early adopters also prefer technology to be cheap or free. Of course, there's exceptions to all of this, but early adopters, since they're playing around with all kinds of different products, they don't want to be paying for something that they might discard 2 weeks later. Now, contrast this with mainstream users. Mainstream users use products that save them either money or time. Of course, mainstream users also use products like Farmville that cost them money and time, but that's kind of beside the point here. And the point is that it's hard to convince mainstream users to use your product because they're already very comfortable with the product that they're using. And so, and on top of that, they're not even looking for a replacement. And so they also know that the first couple of iterations of any product is going to be buggy. So they're going to wait and let others test your product first. Since mainstream users are looking for products that can save them time or money, they value products that work out of the box. They understand that the time they're spending integrating with other technologies is time that they're not really spending delivering value for their own end users. Mainstream users also will have a lot of applications already running, and they want to minimize the risks of adopting your product. And so they expect your product to work really well with whatever systems they already have in place. They won't replace all their tech stack with your shiny new technology. So they want you to have a roadmap on how they can slowly migrate into your product. And since mainstream users want to save money and time, they are going to do a cost-benefit analysis on your product, and they're happy to pay you if they think you're saving them time or money. So as you can see, early adopters and mainstream users are different. They have different needs, they have different goals, and this transition period and transition process from pitching to early adopters and now pitching to mainstream users can be a make it or break it moment for your product or your company. And that's why some people call this moment the chasm. Of course, you can decide not to do anything about this. So you can decide, I'm going to continue pitching just to my current set of users, my early adopters. But you need to account that there's only a finite amount of users like this out in the world. So if you decide to do that, you're probably committing to a strategy where your product won't have a global reach. Now that you understand what the chasm thing is all about, I'm going to talk a bit about the impact that this transition period can have for your teams. But for that, I think we need to compare the user journey for the both kinds of users. Since the very beginning, while they're learning about your product, all the way until they're already using your product on a daily basis. Let's start with early adopters. Early adopters probably learn about your product on Hacker News or Product Hunt or any other place where people gather to discuss unicorns. If they think your product is good enough, they'll give it a spin. If your product is open source, they'll probably fork from your repository and build it. But even if you're closed source, they're going to get the bits from you and install it. Once they get the product to run, they're going to start hacking and building pet projects. And if they like what they're seeing, they're going to continue using and telling other people about your product. And all this journey from beginning to end is mostly done in self-service mode. So they'll probably be reading your blog post or reading your API docs, but that's mostly it. They are not reaching out to you, and they don't even expect you to interact with them. And they want to work by themselves and building amazing things. The other interesting part of this whole journey is that it takes at most a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Now, contrast this with mainstream users, specifically in the enterprise space. Things are totally different. I mean, mainstream users learn about your product from someone else. It's probably an early adopter, but they're not proactively searching for products. If they believe that your product might help them solve a problem, they're going to start comparing your product against your competitors. And even when they think you're the best, they won't really believe everything you say to them. So they'll start running proofs of concept and really test out if your product delivers on what you're promising. Of course, proofs of concept can only take you so far. And there's a bunch of things, especially non-functional requirements, that you can't really test out with just proofs of concept. Things like performance, security, scalability, high availability. To really test these things out, you need to be fully committed into the product, and they don't want to be doing that. Since mainstream users want to minimize the risk of adopting your product, they'll also start small at first, and then they'll expand their adoption. Of course, along the way, they'll be using your product probably like no one ever has done before. And so they'll be finding all sorts of bugs or usability problems and things like that. So they want to be assured that you have support for them. And if you're lucky and their adoption increases, they also want to be sure that they're using the best practices out there so that they don't run into problems later on. And they also want to have ways to train their own team members to get up to speed quickly with your product. And of course, if they really like your product, they start using it, they'll start demanding more features, sometimes features that you don't even have in your roadmap. And they want to have a way to upgrade with minimal impact to their users. So as you can see, throughout this journey, there's all different kinds of teams that need to be interacting with users. There's a couple of touch points here that can be mostly done in self-service mode, like a marketing website. But a big part of the journey is really you and your team hand-holding these users along the way. And this really places a big burden on your team. You'll be having several teams contacting with users back and forward and for extended periods of time. I mean, if you look at all this user journey from beginning to end, especially in the enterprise context, it can take weeks if you're lucky, but usually it takes months since someone has learned about your product and then is using your product in production. So at this point, you might be thinking, this is all good because most of the things I'm talking about are related to support, training, sales, customer success, marketing, yada, 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 but you might be working on the engineering department, so you're all good. But if you look at the way your team's structured, it kind of looks like this, with this tiny caveat. And so if your product is new, your product is moving fast, your marketing, services, support teams are probably also new, or they can't keep up with the changes that you're making to the product, guess who's going to have to help them out? The thing is that we're in the age of open floors and instant communication, and the people in all these organizations are going to reach out to you. And while instant communication is awesome because it allows information to spread faster and people to solve problems faster, this also means that your engineering resources might get constant interruptions. And so I'm not really advocating for silos, but you need to be very careful on how you're managing your engineering time, because if you're crossing the chasm, you might be putting the next generation of your product at risk. And this is critical during this time, because if you fail to ship, you're losing a lot of ground to your competition. And so since this is basically a problem on how to scale communication with external users, but also internal users, I think that having good documentation can help you address these issues. Good docs can provide a self-service way for your users to solve their own problems. And this has two side effects. It can reduce the number of interactions that your users are having with you, but also will make that the few interactions that really need to happen are richer, because your users are going to be able to gather all the information they need, will be able to do their own homework, and will, once they reach out to you, they're going to ask more meaningful and deeper questions. And the same thing can happen with internal interactions too. Good documentation can serve as a buffer between internal teams. In fact, if you're building your applications using microservices or any sort of service-oriented architecture, you can even provide documentation to other engineering teams so that people don't have to ask you every time they're trying to integrate with your products or trying to use your product or service. So at this point, you might be thinking, but I have Slack, and all my conversations happen in public channels where others can see, so if someone asks me for something, everyone in the team is going to be able to benefit from my answer. And in theory, yes, but my experience tells me that's barely the case. And I think this happens because Slack allows you to have tons of parallel conversations in real time. So what ends up happening is that only you and the people following in real time the conversation get to benefit from your answer. And I think that an example that kind of illustrates this is just 2 weeks ago, I saw 3 people, including myself, going into a Slack channel and ask the exact same question in the span of 2 hours. And this is stupid. So I can only imagine how much time we're spending throughout all Docker, throughout all the Slack channels that we have, repeating ourselves and asking the same question over and over again in the span of a week or a month. And I think it would also be fair if you told me, but I'm already doing documentation, and I have documentation, and I still have to answer questions all day long. And I think you're probably right. I see a lot of companies that have documentation and still have problems scaling information. But I think you could argue that documentation is like code in a way. Just because you have more lines of code, it doesn't mean that your product has more quality. And the same thing about docs. Just because you have more lines of docs doesn't mean that your docs are good. It doesn't mean that your docs are helping people solve the problems that they have. And so here's kind of a framework for you to use and really check your docs. Your docs need to be easy to find, updated, useful, and engaging, and in this order. What do I mean by your docs need to be easy to find? It's not just that it needs to be easy to find information for your product using Google. That's also true, but it needs to be faster for a user to solve their own problem using their browser than having to ask someone else. And so for that, I think you need to be providing help in context. So if I'm a user, I'm on the CLI. I don't know how to use a command. I should be able to get help there. I should not have to open a browser tab. If I'm using your GUI, the same thing. I should not have to open a separate tab and type something on Google. And of course, if everything else fails, I should be able to search on Google. And so this all ensures that both internal and external users can get help really fast and without having to ask a fellow human for help. I think that something that you should absolutely not do is have your documentation behind a login page. If you're doing that, users won't be able to find their answers using Google, so they're going to call you for help. And the same thing for PDFs. So search engines can now crawl PDFs, but no one really links back to PDFs, so your docs will never rank high on a Google search. Okay, your docs need to be updated. This is kind of self-explanatory, I think. Outdated docs make users not really trust your documentation because it forces them to debug your product and try to understand what is the intended behavior of a feature. So if they happen to be an external user, they'll probably call support. If they're an internal user, they're going to tap you in the shoulder and ask for help or go into Slack. And while all the quotes that I have in this presentation are totally made up, this one is not. This is a quote from a real user. And while we had 4 people working in documentation, this user was still being forced to debug and call support because he didn't rely on the docs. He couldn't rely on the docs. I also said that documentation needs to be useful. And I know that this is totally vague, so let me expand a bit on this. What I mean is that I think we need to acknowledge up front that no one really wants to read documentation, and no one really does it for fun, and that's totally okay. If you're reading documentation for fun, come see me after this talk. We can do a therapy session. I think people are reading docs because they're solving or trying to solve a problem that they have. So to create useful documentation, you first need to help your users build good and sound mental models about your features. And then you need to teach them how to connect that mental model to a bigger picture. And only after, you can really teach them how to use the features. I think you'll never be able to really guess the problem that your user is facing at a specific moment in time, but you can at least give them the right mental models and examples that they can use to then apply in their own situations. And I know that this is still a bit abstract, so let me give you an example in the context of Docker. Even if you don't know anything about Docker, Docker has 3 key primitives. You have images, you have containers, and you have registries. So good documentation will explain you what these primitives are. And then the good documentation would also explain you how images, containers, and registries relate to one another. But this is only the first part. Then for documentation to be useful, it needs to teach you how these primitives relate to a broader picture, which in this case is building, shipping, and running your application. And of course, after this is totally useless unless I know how to create my own images and deploy my own containers. So documentation needs to follow up and teach you how to do that. And finally, your docs need to be engaging. If we acknowledge up front that no one really needs or wants to be reading docs, and at the same time we're really making our docs boring, it's possible that people will prefer to endure the pain of having to learn things by trial and error instead of taking the time to read the documentation. So instead of making your docs describe in beautiful prose what your product does, something that you should be doing, and it's probably easier to do. I think no one does this naturally. I think this is way more natural for anyone that's developing applications. Is just throw in code samples, throw in diagrams, throw in videos, whatever. Anything that allows me as a user to skip the part that I don't care about and start and move on to the part that I care, and then I can paste and run your commands. I think we've covered a lot of ground so far, so let me kind of rewind and recap for a bit. We discussed that crossing the chasm is hard because it requires you to interact with a different kind of user. This can drain your engineering resources, and then docs can help you avoid that, but only if they're good enough. And by good enough, I mean your documentation is findable, up to date, useful, and engaging. But making documentation like that is hard. And most people don't really have the resources for doing this. But surprisingly, I don't think you really need a lot of resources. I think the problem might be with the process that you're using to create documentation. I think that if you use the right process, you can really create things that you're going to be surprised about. So let me share a bit the process I think you should be using. Most of us are using some kind of agile methodology to develop our products. Usually a feature starts small, and then eventually it requires more and more resources to make the feature come to life. And after a while, you don't need so many people working in that feature. The feature gets more stable, so you start phasing out and allocating people to some other projects. Now, if you zoom in a particular feature, it kind of looks like this. Maybe you have a product manager interviewing users, trying to understand how the feature should be built, and then creating a spec. Then the UX team comes along and helps you define what are going to be the interactions the user will have with the product. And then finally, developers come along and will do their magic. Once this cycle is over, you have improved an existing feature or have a new feature in your product. And now, most teams are not really creating documentation during this cycle. I would even argue that most teams are not even creating documentation in this cycle either. What ends up happening is that most of the times people develop a couple of features, and then someone in the company realizes, oh man, we don't have docs, so we need to rush. Someone goes ahead, bites the bullet, usually a developer, And they start writing documentation, and they start creating documentation for features that already exist. But of course, this is kind of a snapshot in time, and this is not the reality. The reality is more like this, where your product is evolving. And so this person is creating documentation for a product that is changing and changing a lot and changing fast. And so with this approach, I'm not sure it's possible to create documentation that's easy to find, it's always up to date, it's useful and engaging. I'm saying that this is hard because you're essentially using agile processes to develop your product. But then you're using waterfall to create your documentation. And these two methodologies end up clashing with one another. And so when people look at this, I think they see two options. The first option is, okay, so let's develop the feature first, let's create the documentation after, and then let's deploy the product. But I mean, this is totally waterfall. We're in the 21st century. We should not be doing this. Option two is to create documentation as we develop the product. And this doesn't make a lot of sense either, does it? I mean, how can you create documentation for a product that doesn't really exist yet? But I think that counterintuitively, this is exactly what you should be doing. You should be documenting the product while you're creating the product. And to understand why, I think we need to go back in time. Not so long ago, we thought that first you create the product and then you make your product more beautiful. And it kind of took us a while to get this, but we eventually understood that what we wanted wasn't so much a beautiful product. What we wanted was a product that was simple and easy to use that happens to be beautiful. And so we've realized that you can't build a product and then make it simple, because once the complexity is there, you can't take it off. And so you need to consider making your product simple from day one. And it's kind of the same thing with docs. The goal is not really to check an item in your checklist. I think the goal is more, how can I help external and internal users to learn my product, but in a way that scales, and in a way that can keep up with a product that is moving very fast. And I think that is the part that matters the most. And also, what matters the most is that you have time so that you can think about the next generation of your product, so that you don't spend your days on Slack and on email answering to your users and your internal teams. Now, I know that this process seems crazy at first, but I've been using it at Docker, and I've used it in other companies before, and I think it kind of works. I've noticed 3 different side effects of using this process. One is your docs are always ready for a beta. Most teams really struggle with this, and along the way, someone decides to, oh, we're doing a beta, and it's going to be public, so we need docs. And most teams kind of do a real effort to try to keep up and create documentation in time for the beta. But with this process, you're essentially iteratively refining your docs. So almost for sure, you're not going to have perfect docs, but you're improving your docs as you go. So this is kind of continuous iteration on the documentation. And so you can decide, okay, we're going live now, and it's not going to be perfect, but we can file issues, we can track the problems, and we can continue solving them as we go. In fact, at Docker and other companies, I've now went through kind of almost 10 major releases, and I don't remember the last time that my products didn't ship a beta without documentation. So this is kind of interesting. Another side effect of using this process is that sometimes when you're creating documentation, you're using your product from end to end. And this is great because sometimes you have different development teams working across the product, but in totally separate features. And sometimes when you're using the product from end to end, you get to realize, oh, we're building stuff that doesn't make sense as a whole. So we still have time to go back to the development teams and help find a way to make these features play well with one another and really create a better experience for the end user. And finally, another side effect of creating docs iteratively as you go is that you're doing dog fooding. So you're reading the specs that product managers are creating, you're playing with the mocks that the UX team is creating, you're building the product locally, you're deploying the product, you're using the product as a real user. And so you're essentially an alpha tester of the product. So you can file bug reports when things are crashing on you, and you can really test out if the product is easy or not. And so the interesting part about this whole loop is that when you find these kinds of things, you don't have to rush. You still have time because the product is not out there. And so you can take all this feedback and make your product really awesome instead of shipping it like that. And so at Docker, we've been following this process to create documentation. And so I also want to share some strategies because I know that this is really broad. And so I want to share some strategies and some tools that we've been using to kind of help us along this journey. And this is probably obvious. I bet that most teams nowadays are looking like this. Since we want to be doing specs, UX, development, and docs all at the same time, we need to be having multidisciplinary teams working together as a single one. And we need to make sure that communication is faster and everyone is responsible and committed to the end result. So on paper, our teams at Docker kind of look like this, but in our day-to-day operations, they look more like this. So we end up embedding product managers, designers, developers, docs people inside a single product team. And so we end up getting the best of both worlds with this. We have cohesive teams that really care and love their products, but we also maintain horizontal teams that can help cross-pollinate information across the different products and across the organization. And Docker is kind of small. So sometimes you have the same designer or the same docs person working across multiple projects. So in my own case, I do documentation for 3 or 4 products at Docker. And so that's kind of awesome, in fact, because it forces me to have a high-level picture of everything that's going on at Docker and how do our products integrate with one another. Another thing that we do is essentially continuous integration and deployment, but for documentation. This allows us to move faster. We don't spend time integrating and releasing documentation. It's all automatic once I merge. And this also forces us to kind of iteratively refine the docs. You write, you merge, it's live, you repeat. And also the docs are live all the time. Sometimes if I'm making changes to docs.docker.com, you're going to see them right away. If I'm working on a private release, it's still available, but only internally. And so once we decide to do a beta, it's just turning on a button and it's live for everyone. Another thing that you should be doing too is managing documentation and the code inside the same repository. This way, if you submit a pull request changing functionality, you should be also updating the docs in the same pull request. We kind of stopped doing this at Docker because after a while, it was getting hard to create docs that were consistent across 12 to 15 products. But if you're only getting started, I would advise against that. I would advise you to manage everything in the same repository. Once you start having consistency problems, your users are going to tell you. And so by then, you can just find ways to deal with that. In terms of technologies, we use very simple technologies. We use Jekyll, a static website generator. We write docs in Markdown, so you can use whatever editor you'd like. And we use the typical GitHub workflow. So to contribute to docs, you fork the repository, you make changes in your own branch, and then you open a pull request. Of course, we want to make it simple so that anyone can help us fix our docs if they find something out to date. And so what we end up doing is on every documentation page, there's a link on the page where if you click, it's going to start a pull request from your browser. And you don't even know that the pull request is going on, but and as a user, you probably don't care. So sometimes you're committing like 12 times in a row. You might not care, but from our perspective, we can still follow the GitHub process. We have reviews, and if we decide 12 commits is too much, we can just squash it and make it go live like that. And so once we get to a point where we've discussed the PR, you've integrated some of the feedback, and now we've merged the PR, this is all automatic. So GitHub triggers a webhook on Docker Cloud. So Docker Cloud will start building a Docker image. And so that Docker image will contain all of the documentation, including the changes that you've made, but also everything that is needed for the docs website to run. So in our own case, our Docker image contains Nginx as a web server, and then basically we take all the markdown files, we run them through Jekyll, and that will create HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and we feed those whole files into Nginx. And that's kind of the cool thing about Docker, is that you're creating a single package, and it has all the dependencies that it needs to run. You don't need anything else. Once Docker Cloud finishes the build process, it tags that Docker image as latest. And so since latest is kind of special, it triggers another webhook automatically in Docker Cloud that will start doing a rolling upgrade into all the other docs containers. So once this process has finished, all the containers in the bottom are running the new version of the documentation. And we also want our docs to be highly available. So we also run these containers on different servers. And so what we do is we have a separate container serving as a load balancer that kind of load balances requests across all the other content containers. And we also use that as TLS termination so that you have HTTPS when accessing your docs. And finally, something that I think we do really well at Docker is that communication is open by default, and you don't really need to be an open source company for this. Even if your product is closed sourced, you can open source your docs. It's like your users are already using it, there's nothing private in there, so you can open source that part of your product. And so if you're doing that, you're at least allowing other people in your company to keep your documentation up to date, but also you're empowering your power users to help you with that. So instead of calling support, they can fix typos, they can fix outdated information, and things like that. So remember, to cross the chasm, you need docs.